That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, we're going to go through and we are going to be talking about our wide receiver rankings this week. And not going to lie, we got some pretty good matchups. I feel at the running back position, every single one of those top running backs, it's like, yeah, we're starting them. We love them, but it's probably going to be a spot where those teams are looking to throw the ball instead of running it. Well, yeah, that's going to be bumping up the wide receiver position this week. Of course, before we get into the rankings, go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. We just passed 62,000 subscribers. So, of course, thank you so much for everybody who's been supporting the channel all season. And, you know, we're going to be giving away free Fantasy Football Network hats as a giveaway just so I can give back to y'all every single video this year. And our first winner going to come out to Joey, and our second winner going to go out to Vraken. All you all have to do to win a Fantasy Flag Network hat is make sure you go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Every time you do that, you get entered in to win a free Fantasy Flag Network hat. You win that hat, send me an email ASAP with your physical address so I can send that out to you. And also, before we get into the video, you're going to see throughout the video player props up on the screen for each one of these wide receivers. Those player props would be available. If you want to go bet on a player prop, you think a wide receiver is going to have more or less receiving yards than that this upcoming week, you can go do that on Underdog Fantasy. And when you sign up for Underdog Fantasy and you use promo code FLOCK, they match you dollar for dollar on that deposit up to a $100 deposit. Not only do they have player props there, but they also have fantasy drafts that you can get into, and you can draft a fantasy team just for 1 week. And we've had a lot of confusion with Underdog Fantasy. A lot of people think that they have to live in a state where gambling or sports betting is allowed. This is not technically sports betting. This is like DFS. If you can play DraftKings in your state, if you can play FanDuel, you can do Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the only states it's not available in, like Nevada, Louisiana, Washington State, and Hawaii. I'm pretty sure it's available everywhere else. So, of course, go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code FLOCK. Nothing supports this channel more. And let's dive into these rankings. Let's lead it off with our wide receiver one this week, Davante Adams. Now, order is restored. Y'all know how many leagues we drafted Davante Adams in the first round based on what we had last season, based on also injury rates to running backs. Nonetheless, finally happy to have him at our wide receiver one spot. I mean, we got a couple things going on here. Going up against the Minnesota Vikings and also with Davante Adams. I mean, something that we have talked about over and over and over again in these live streams is the fact that I promise you it's getting better for here. I mean, yes, this is a wide receiver that's had a good season so far. He's a mid wide receiver one. He's the wide receiver 6 on a points per game basis. It's going to get drastically better because you know with Davante Adams, he is going to have a touchdown rate that is higher than league average based on the red zone role of what we have seen for essentially the past 4 seasons now. And with Davante Adams, he's had 98 targets this year with 3 touchdowns. So we know the touchdown rate's going to get a bump up. We know that Davante Adams is going to be that stud wide receiver averaging 11 targets a game that we can just go through and plug and play every single week. Now, why we actually get to rank him at number 1 this week is obviously Cooper Kupp's on bye, but let's overlook that. With Davante Adams, he's going to be 1 in that first tier. And then honestly, I wanted to leave Davante Adams alone in that top tier by himself. Tyreek Hill, we're going to have to throw him there. With Tyreek Hill going up against the Dallas Cowboys, going over to see what we have from Vegas this week. Y'all know I always say, I mean, Underdog Fantasy, any sports betting site that you're going to find that literally are putting out odds for you to go and bet on, 100% of the time, they are smarter than us. That is something we have to be taking advantage of. We have to be looking at their opinion because they wouldn't be coming out here and they wouldn't be profitable books if they weren't smarter than all of us here. So let's look at what they have right now for the over-under on this Dallas Cowboys and this Kansas City Chiefs game. Right now, they have the over-under at 56.5. There's not another game this week that's over 50 points for that over-under. So yeah, right now, this Dallas Cowboys and this Kansas City Chiefs game should be a full-blown shootout. You want as many pieces as you can get. You're about to see that we have the Dallas Cowboys wide receivers ranked extremely highly as well. So yeah, we're going to have Tyreek Hill in tier 1 alongside Davante Adams, as we have said time and time again. Remember, everybody was panicking on Tyreek Hill coming into this past week, which was hilarious because Tyreek Hill was still the wide receiver 3 on a points per game basis. He still stands there after dropping 27 points this past week, obviously in the game where Mahomes threw for 5 passing touchdowns. You don't need to be worried about this Kansas City Chiefs offense. I'm happy that we don't have to say that over and over and over again in the live streams this week as we've had to over the past 2 or 3. But yeah, Tyreek Hill in that top tier. Now going down to our second tier here, A wide receiver that's not going to be this high in my rest of season rankings. If you go over to Patreon really quick and you pull up my rest of season rankings, we are actually going to have CeeDee Lamb a little bit lower than this, but you have to have CeeDee Lamb at wide receiver 3 for this week in particular, with Lamb as a wide receiver that also has been dominant as of late. Our rest of season rankings, we actually have him as a top 10 wide receiver, but he's in tier 3 behind some of these other players behind him. And if we're going to be looking at what we've had over the recent weeks with CeeDee Lamb, this is a wide receiver that this past one, comes out, pops off for over 28 fantasy points. Drops 94 receiving yards, 6 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns against the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, this is a Dallas Cowboys offense that, remember, fell flat on its face against the Denver Broncos the week before. We were able to go and look at what Las Vegas was telling us, and they showed us that the Dallas Cowboys were projected to be the highest scoring offense against the Atlanta Falcons last week. We are willing to go, okay, well, Vegas knows best. Let's listen to Las Vegas. Let's be overly aggressive on this Dallas Cowboys offense with what we are making in our start-sit decisions a week ago and how we are going through and trading for CeeDee Lamb. And yeah, clearly it paid off. This Dallas Cowboys offense still is at the very top of the NFL, despite what happened 2 weeks ago against Denver. This Kansas City Chiefs defense, we know, is a bad one against pretty much the pass, the run. This is going to be a shootout, as we've already discussed. This over-under on this game is 56.5 points. I think we have CeeDee Lamb as our wide receiver 3 here, considering the matchup. Now, our wide receiver 4 is going to be someone that, we've been on for a while. Let's go over to Stefon Diggs. With Stefon Diggs, it was funny coming into this past week because we were getting a lot of pushback on Patreon with our rest of season rankings. I'm going, how the hell can Stefon Diggs be ranked here? He's been a low-end wide receiver 2. And honestly, I had no explanation. I had no explanation on the failure of Stefon Diggs going into this past week, because you were looking at the opportunity in Buffalo, and we were seeing that Vegas was telling us every single week that this was the highest projected offense of the week. Every single week. Vegas loves the Buffalo Bills. We saw that the overall passing efficiency was still there with the Buffalo Bills at that league-wide level. And on top of this, Stefon Diggs, he was getting 9 to 10 targets a week. So I had no explanation on why Diggs wasn't coming out and just giving us that elite fantasy production week in and week out. Well, we get that week 30 points against the New York Jets. Here, the Indianapolis Colts don't have some super good pass defense. You're a little bit worried about their run defense in particular. Their pass defense isn't necessarily there. So yeah, Stefon Diggs playing one of the best offenses in the NFL, consistently getting 9 to 10 targets. The fewest targeted week that he has had so far this season was 5 targets against the Kansas City Chiefs back in week 5. But outside of that, he has had at least 12 fantasy points every single week, coming off a week where he just dropped 30. I think you'd be very excited about Stefon Diggs. Now, our next wide receiver, coming off a very poor week a week ago, doesn't matter. I'm going to still have him as a top 5 option. He has a good matchup this week. Let's go over to A.J. Brown going up against the Houston Texans. Now, with A.J. Brown, obviously, this is going to be an offense that maybe runs the ball effectively with Donta Foreman, with Adrian Peterson, with Jeremy McNichols. I don't care. And trust me, I get it. Over the past 2 weeks, Brown has been disappointing. This past week against the New Orleans Saints, I was going through and I was saying that he was a must-start wide receiver despite the matchup that he had against Marshawn Lattimore, despite how effective Marshawn Lattimore has been at just shutting down opposing wide receivers essentially over the past 6 weeks now. We were ignoring that because the week before, he went up against Jalen Ramsey in the Los Angeles Rams, and he was able to draw 11 targets and have everything funnel through A.J. Brown in this offense. So yes. I know it's annoying. He does take that step back this past week. And what's also very frustrating is looking at A.J. Brown. The points per game numbers are completely skewed here, where you can't even look at his points per game and get a good idea of what we have seen from A.J. Brown so far this season, because this has been a wide receiver that we remember earlier this season. He was just in and out of the lineup for the Tennessee Titans with that injury. Here in week 3, he leaves early in the Colts game. In week 5, after missing week 4, remember, against the Jacksonville Jaguars, honestly, A.J. Brown shouldn't have even played that game if you were looking at practice reports. So, if we were going to get a good estimate on A.J. Brown's points per game, right now, he's been a wide receiver 3 in fantasy. But if we go through, if we actually adjust this and removing the week that he left early with injury and also removing the week that, he probably shouldn't have played, you're going to take his overall fantasy points from 116.7 down to 109.6. And then how many games would be in that sample? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so then we're going to be bumping us points per game up to about 16, which would make him still a mid wide receiver 2. I think that with A.J. Brown, no Julio Jones in this offense, if they're going to effectively move the ball through the air, it's not going to be through Marcus Johnson. It's going to be mainly through A.J. Brown, especially when he has the best defensive matchup that he has seen over essentially the past month. So we're going to be playing A.J. Brown as a top 5 wide receiver here against the Houston Texans. And now our next wide receiver, honestly, I feel like we're disrespecting this man every single week, it seems like. Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel is the wide receiver 2 in fantasy, only behind Cooper Kupp. Clearly, they are doing everything that they can to get Deebo Samuel the ball. He has 5 rushing attempts this past week, a rushing touchdown as well. This is his second rushing touchdown of the season. He also gets 97 receiving yards, the receiving touchdown. It's just so hard with this 49ers offense, knowing that Kittle is going to be a primary target as well for Jimmy Garoppolo. And more importantly, this is a team that simply does not want to throw the ball. Like, if you're going to go through, look at this past week. I mean, this past week for the 49ers and Kyle Shanahan, this is their dream, to get up early with their defense and to be able to just run the ball consistently in the second half. And that's what we end up seeing playing out. You have on total, let's do some math here. I mean, you have over 40 rushing attempts for this San Francisco 49ers offense this past week. And you only have 19 passing attempts for Jimmy Garoppolo for less than 200 passing yards. So Deebo Samuel's been fantastic, but Brandon Ayuk has continued to increase his role. George Kittle, obviously being back, is going to be taking up a high percentage of that overall passing volume. I'm going to be a little hesitant to rank Deebo Samuel over A.J. Brown, over Stefon Diggs, over CeeDee Lamb, even though, I mean, Deebo Samuel so far this season on a points per game basis has been ahead of every single wide receiver you're going to see on this list. So, I mean, in theory, you would maybe have him at 1, especially against a bad defense in the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm going to be a little bit hesitant because this team clearly wants to run the ball. And right now, I mean, I am very surprised by this. You know, I always say Vegas knows more than us. If we're going to be seeing a over-under or a spread that we don't think is right, there's something I don't know. And right now, they actually have the 49ers only as 6-point favorites against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I thought that would be in the double digits. But nonetheless, you would assume the 49ers to be able to lead the majority of the game, to be able to run the ball effectively in the second half. I think that maybe limits Deebo just a little bit. Now, we got to pick this up. Dear God, let's go down a tier. Let's go over to our wide receiver 7, and let's talk about Justin Jefferson here going up against the Green Bay Packers. With Justin Jefferson, not much to discuss. You're not in love with this Green Bay Packers matchup. I will definitely say that. You know what? I lied to you. This is such a bad matchup for Justin Jefferson. We're going to have to move him down a little bit because this Packers defense has been on lock over the past few weeks. I mean, going through and looking at what they've been able to do, they just shut out the New Orleans Saints. And at the same time, they went through the week beforehand and limited the Kansas City Chiefs to 13 points overall. I know a lot of people wanted to focus in on, no, Patrick Mahomes is dead. No, Patrick Mahomes can't do anything. Or what if the Green Bay Packers have an elite level defense? They limited Kyler Murray and the Arizona Cardinals to 21 points the week before that. By far and away, Kyler Murray's worst game so far this season. So they've given Russell Wilson a really hard time. They probably created Russell Wilson's worst game of his career. And then they gave Patrick Mahomes one of the worst games of his career. And they gave Kyler Murray his worst game of the season. So you know what? Let's move Justin Jefferson down to the bottom of this tier, actually. We're instead here going to rank Chris Godwin as wide receiver 7. Now, the reason that we're going to have Godwin here is I'm expecting that you're not going to have Antonio Brown this week. If we don't have if Antonio Brown does play, I think you have to actually lower Chris Godwin down. But it sounds like Godwin's going to be 100% healthy going into this game against the New York Giants. This should not be a defense that we have to worry about too much. I know this past week, Godwin definitely disappointed with only about 12.5 fantasy points. But going back to what we had the 2 previous weeks with no Antonio Brown, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 111 receiving yards, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 140 receiving yards, and he had a receiving touchdown both contests. I mean, you're expecting the bounce back for Tom Brady here. So if Antonio Brown doesn't play, I actually think that we have to have Godwin at wide receiver 7. We're going to have Jamar Chase at wide receiver 8. I mean, with Jamar Chase, this is a wide receiver that we were saying is a sell high candidate about 3 or 4 weeks ago whenever he was coming out dropping 200-yard receiving games, and he was just dropping 34 fantasy points. But I mean, we never moved him in our overall rankings since then. Like with Jamar Chase, he got a bump up to where he is a mid wide receiver 1 in our rest of season rankings. He's actually our wide receiver 8 in our rest of season rankings over there. And that's where he's been over the past few weeks. You do not lower Jamar Chase down at all. If anything, Jamar Chase went from being overvalued when people were ranking him above Davante Adams to now when people thinking that Jamar Chase is in the same range of Deontay Johnson, all of a sudden he is a massive buy low. It's hilarious to see the flip on Jamar Chase that people have had just because he comes out 32 receiving yards, 49 receiving yards in back-to-back weeks. Ignore that. Please ignore that. You're looking at the past 2 weeks. He also had 9 targets and 13 targets. The same exact role is there. You have to be extremely excited about what we'll have from Jamar Chase. Lock him in. He's a mid wide receiver 1 every single week. And then, Justin Jefferson, the last spot of this list, is just going to be with that Green Bay Packers matchup. We need to avoid it. Now let's go down one more tier. Let's go to our wide receiver 10, Mike Evans, New York Giants. Nothing to say here. I mean, yes, you're hoping for the touchdown. Not in the same tier of Chris Godwin. We're ranking this as if Antonio Brown isn't playing. If Antonio Brown does play, Mike Evans falls. Now, our next wide receiver will be DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 11. Now, I know with Hopkins, he's been so damn disappointing. This season can't get on the field, and it's hilarious because with DeAndre Hopkins, this is one of the very few wide receivers that you could look at throughout his entire career and say, you know what? He's missing no time at all. This is a wide receiver that plays 16 games every single season. Since then, I mean, maybe we haven't been able to expect that. Nonetheless, I think that with DeAndre Hopkins here, even if you look at the points per game, they're going to be a little bit skewed because remember back in week 2, he had the rib injury. Then he played through that week 3 and 4. And he honestly probably shouldn't have even done that looking at practice reports. And then he also left week 8 early with the hamstring injury. So Hopkins, he's been dealing with a multitude of injuries. I think that we actually probably get back DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray against the Seattle Seahawks this week based on the fact that, I mean, they've missed now 2, and are they going to go on 3 weeks if they didn't decide to just put them on the IR right away? So I'd imagine that we probably get Hopkins back and playing. And if you're looking at the games that Hopkins has played in full and's been 100% healthy in, 26 fantasy points, 20 fantasy points, 20 fantasy points, 18 fantasy points, still the consistent wide receiver that you're looking for. I think we will have Hopkins as a low-end wide receiver 1. And then we're going to go down a tier from here, and we're actually going to be going to our wide receiver 12 in DK Metcalf. Now, obviously with DK Metcalf, very disappointing this past week. You can't ignore that. And I was willing to go through and rank DK Metcalf aggressively. I think what we should do instead of getting worried about what we have had with Russell Wilson here, we should be overlooking the 1 week that we had against the Green Bay Packers. And we should be willing to look at pretty much the decade of data that we have of Russell Wilson being one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm not really worried about the Seattle Seahawks offense. I will have DK Metcalf ranked as a top 12 wide receiver. A little bit of a tough matchup, however, against the Arizona Cardinals. So that's why he's actually not going to be ahead of those players like Mike Evans and DeAndre Hopkins. Now, our next wide receiver at wide receiver 13 will be Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers with Keenan Allen, another wide receiver that was on buy low list for us earlier this season. And clearly just in a PPR format, what we always talk about, volume, just like what he had at the beginning of the season here. Keenan Allen consistently getting the targets in Los Angeles. Keenan Allen, when he is getting 10 targets a game, essentially. He's had 93 targets through 9 games so far. He is a wide receiver that has such a high floor. I mean, this is someone that his worst week so far this season, he dropped 10 fantasy points against the Baltimore Ravens. That was the game that the Los Angeles Chargers literally couldn't move the ball down the field here. Tough matchup against the Steelers. Still going to have Keenan Allen as a high-end wide receiver 2. We're going to have a couple other wide receivers in this tier here. We're going to have Amari Cooper as well against the Kansas City Chiefs. As we've already discussed, I mean, with Amari, this was a wide receiver that was on a sell high wide receiver list for us about 2 to 3 weeks ago. I mean, coming off of that monstrous performance that he had with, everybody watching him. I don't know if that was a Sunday night or a Monday night game against the Minnesota Vikings. He had the game-winning touchdown, a sell-high wide receiver clearly, knowing that you were going to get Michael Gallup coming back in, knowing that with Amari Cooper, he is the exact opposite of Keenan Allen. He's a little bit unstable. He's a little bit inconsistent. Over the past 2 weeks, yes, he's only dropped 5 fantasy points and 9 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons. But we still know that Amari Cooper is the same wide receiver he's been for years now. He is that wide receiver that has the overall upside to come out here and be a top 5 wide receiver any given week. You wouldn't be surprised if it's in a contest where it should be a full-blown shootout between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Dallas Cowboys. Now, our next wide receiver in this tier will be Deontay Johnson. Tough matchup against the Chargers. I mean, with the Chargers here, they actually have a very soft run defense that you would expect that Najee Harris is able to just consistently go out there and pick up chunk plays. That's why we have Najee Harris ranked as our running back 1 this week. The Chargers have been fantastic against opposing wide receivers so far, so I will have Deontay Johnson here as a mid wide receiver 2. And then Terry McLaurin will be our wide receiver 16 going up against the Carolina Panthers. Another very tough matchup. And my God, it's so funny to see what we had as the reactions on our sell high wide receiver video. On our sell high video, we opened that up going, okay, we are not selling every single one of these players. We're going through and we're ranking the top 6 worst fantasy football playoff schedules for the wide receiver position. And we're going to be taking an objective stance on if we think we should be selling one of these players or if we should just be holding. And we go, okay, well, Terry McLaurin, he has a horrible fantasy football playoff schedule. So we have to mention him on this list. And we talk about why we're going to be looking to hold, because he was on a buy low video for us the day beforehand saying that the fantasy football marketplace is undervaluing Terry McLaurin for the current moment. So even if he does have that bad fantasy football playoff schedule, you can't look to sell. And people down there, keyboard warriors, they don't even watch the video. They just skim to see what players are included. They go, oh my God, how do you include Terry McLaurin here? How are you putting Terry McLaurin when you had a Did you watch it? No, Terry McLaurin, he is severely underrated in fantasy right now. If you're looking at the volume that he's had, yes, this was a wide receiver that I didn't necessarily love coming into the season. It simply doesn't matter whenever he is getting to 10 targets every single week. Okay, so now going down to our next tier, a wide receiver, I just have to take my L on here. Hollywood Brown, wide receiver 17. Not really taking my L because we've had him ranked here essentially the entire time. We've had him ranked as that mid wide receiver 2, even though, I mean, he has been coming out and he's produced as a top 10 wide receiver so far this season. But we were saying 2 things. We were saying that the addition of Rashad Bateman was going to be creating more target competition for Hollywood Brown than he has ever seen throughout his entire NFL career. And yes, that's true. But the other thing that we were saying was completely false. One thing that we were saying here with Hollywood Brown is the pass to run ratio was going to have to skew in the opposite direction for the Baltimore Ravens. And there was no way in hell that Lamar Jackson was going to continue to average over 300 passing yards a game. That was horrible analysis. We were looking at historical rates for that offense that had a completely different personnel group at wide receiver and at running back. We would naturally assume when you upgrade every wide receiver spot and you're no longer asking Lamar Jackson to throw the Willie Snead, that all of a sudden this is a much better spot for the Baltimore Ravens passing offense. So yeah, I think that after Hollywood Brown has 13 targets this past week, he disappoints, and Rashad Bateman is the guy that goes out there and produces. If anything, I'm probably going to be buying low on Hollywood. I still think he's the mid wide receiver 2. We've had him as the entire time. So Hollywood Brown, tough matchup against the Chicago Bears. Another wide receiver, great talent, will be ranked higher than this some other weeks. Michael Pittman, the issue is he has one of the toughest matchups you could ask for against the Buffalo Bills. You'd imagine that the Buffalo Bills are going to be leading the majority of this game. Going over to seeing what Las Vegas is telling us right now, they have this as a 7.5 point spread. So it's going to be interesting. But I think nonetheless, this is a game that if this team's going to move the ball down the field, it will have to be through Michael Pittman. And our last wide receiver in this list, Tyler Lockett. With Lockett, he's the same exact wide receiver he's always been. Extremely high ceiling, extremely low floor. We're betting on the offensive bounce back for the entire Seattle Seahawks offense, even though it's a tougher matchup against the Arizona Cardinals. So we will have Tyler Lockett right here. Now let's go to our last tier of the video. Let's lead it off with Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle, great matchup against the New York Jets. You could make the argument to have Jalen Waddle in the tier above. You know what? I apologize, Thomas. The more that we think about this, I'm making this ranking with the assumption you have no Davante Parker, with the assumption that you have no Will Fuller. And if that's going to be the case, we have to have Jalen Waddle up in that tier alongside Tyler Lockett, because I may want to play Jalen Waddle over Tyler Lockett. And here with Waddle, the reason for that is if you're looking at weeks that you have not had those wide receivers in this offense, he has just been dominant with the usage that he has had. I mean, if we remove that 1 week that we had against the Buffalo Bills, because remember, that's when Davante Parker came back, and also it was a tough matchup, but it's mainly when Davante Parker came back. 29 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points, 16 and 10. This is a significantly better matchup against the New York Jets than what we've seen over the past few weeks. So yeah, I think we're going to be going and playing Jalen Waddle against the Jets, regardless of who the quarterback is here. Now let's go down to the last tier that we have. Let's go over to T. Higgins. Y'all know how much I love T. Higgins in fantasy, and we were buying low whenever Jamar Chase was going out there and having the 200 receiving yard games, just because you were looking at the target volume with T. Higgins, and you were saying, of course, you're going to get the bounce back. The issue with Higgins, tougher matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders here. I mean, I would actually maybe assume that this is going to be a little bit of a lower scoring game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm surprised to see where this over-under's at. Vegas is telling us that we are just completely wrong. They have this at 49.5. I would assume that this was going to be a game that's a little bit closer to what you may have with the New England Patriots and the Atlanta Falcons over-under at about 47, 46.5. Nonetheless, I mean, with T. Higgins, tougher passing matchup. I think that you would actually see Joe Mixon be heavily used in this contest against the Raiders. Now, Adam Thielen, wide receiver 22 against the Green Bay Packers. Adam Thielen, same wide receiver he's ever been. You play him, you hope he gets a touchdown. He doesn't get a touchdown. You hate yourself. He gets there, you're completely fine. Brandon Cooks, wide receiver 23. I think we have to bet on a small Brandon Cooks bounce back here. I mean, going into the bye week, Tyrod Taylor had just an abysmal performance. And let's go through and let's pull this up with how bad Tyrod Taylor was that last start. And I was expecting Tyrod Taylor was going to come out and be a significant upgrade over Davis Mills, considering Davis Mills, in my opinion, is one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Tyrod Taylor, 3 interceptions, 0 passing touchdowns off of 43 passing attempts. The adjusted yards per attempt must have been so damn low in this game. Must have been like in the 3s for his adjusted yards per attempt against the Miami Dolphins. I mean, it's a fine matchup here against the Tennessee Titans. You know they're going to be throwing the ball often. We know Brandon Cook's going to get 30% of his team's targets. Our last wide receiver will be Hunter Renfrow. Obviously, Renfrow has been fantastic over the past few weeks with the fantasy production that he has had. And I was the person coming out and saying with Hunter Renfrow, this was not someone that we needed to be raising up our rankings. He was the same exact wide receiver with or without Henry Ruggs in this offense. I mean, with no Henry Ruggs, maybe he was going to get an extra target or 2 per game, but the overall level of efficiency in this offense was going to decrease. So yeah, with Hunter Renfrow, I want to stand by that exact same argument that we've had. Because you go through, you look at the receiving yards. 49, 46 receiving yards these past 2 weeks. That's literally exactly in line with what we have seen previously. The difference is he finds the receiving touchdown both weeks. So he goes from, instead of scoring 11 fantasy points, to scoring 17. I don't want to come out here and act like Hunter Renfrow all of a sudden is a guaranteed player to be in our top 24 wide receivers every single week. But nonetheless, when you're getting 7 receptions, when you're getting 46 receiving yards, you do have a high floor in a PPR format. So we will have you as the wide receiver 24 this week against the Bengals. But yeah, of course, thank you so much for coming out and dropping a like on the video. Leave that comment to get entered in to win a free Fantasy Flock Network hat. And of course, go check out some of those player props that they have. Go get in a fantasy draft on Underdog Fantasy. And when you make that first deposit with promo code FLOCK, they bet you dollar for dollar on that deposit up to 100. So please take advantage of that. And yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and I hope that we see you out in the live stream tonight.